good morning and good evening, and also good day, our distinguished panelists, and also our participants at this webinar. So it's really a great honor on behalf of the Center for China and Globalization, and also our co-organizer, Hinrich Foundation, to have this webinar that really the topic of today is that is de-risking U.S.-China conflict. What will the next 4 years be? So this is really very important. And of course, last night we had China announced its 14th five-year plan, and many new objectives has been set, and more detail probably will come out. And also a vision for 2035. So something like that is really get a lot of attention. But most of all, I think that we're having a U.S. election coming up in next few days, actually 3 days from now. So we're holding this webinar at such a really crucial time. I would like to introduce our panelists of this webinar, which we have assembled a very distinguished panelists, I think, for our webinar. And I just introduced in alphabetic order is that we have Alan Dupont. He's the research fellow, Hinrich Foundation, and also he's the CEO of Conjun City Group. He's based in Australia. And we have Mary Lovely. She's a senior fellow, Peterson Institute for International Economics, and also professor at Syracuse University, Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and she has also your time. Thank you. And we have Professor Xin Hong. He's the chair of academic committee of a School of International Studies and director of the Center for American Studies at Renmin University. He's on our CCG expert committee. He's also a counselor of a state council, so a great colleague of mine, Professor Shi. And we have Dr. Teng Jianqun. He's a senior fellow and director of American Studies, China Institute of International Studies, which actually affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. He's also a CCG non-resident senior fellow. And we have also Tim Stratford as the managing director, Covington Berlin law firm, and also former assistant U.S. trade representative. He's an old China hand. And of course, we have Victor Gao. We just heard him. He's just arriving very soon now. My name is Wang Huiyao. I'm the founder and president of Center for China and Globalization. So that's basically the panel we have assembled. So I think that we really, as Victor said, we have an hour and a half almost, and we're going to talk about this de-risk U.S.-China conflict, how we can do, what can be done. And I think CCG will try to get everybody's opinion, and we'll try to write a digest for that, and then to try to summarize all the good points that I hope that all of you are making. And I think, given these two things happening, and China has this finished, it's just fifth plenary of years from now, the U.S. election is coming up. We heard that there's a record turnout in voting, and that means something really get all the attention of U.S. and the world, and of course China. So maybe as I know that Tim has another engagement after 9. Perhaps Tim, you can start first. What can be really the future direction, and what are the next 4 years will be? Maybe your take, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. I think that if we think about the past 4 years, what I would say about the past 4 years is that it has been a period where our two governments have discovered, maybe in a new and more intense ways, the way that their goals and their approaches have been moving in different directions. Of course, our countries have always had different systems and different circumstances. I happened to be in a meeting with a senior foreign affairs official yesterday, and he said, oh, it seems like the US government only discovered yesterday that we are a country that's led by a communist party that's guided by Marxism and Leninism. And in some ways, one gets that impression because there's an emphasis coming out of Washington now about the differences in our countries that we haven't heard that much before. So I think as we try to think about the future of US-China relations, we need to understand what are the nature of these differences and how are we going to deal with them. Very intense trade negotiations. Some people have referred to it as a trade war. And the center point of this has been that our economic systems are different, and that the Chinese system is centered around national goals. And in many industries, there are industrial policies. There is state support for the development of certain industries. And that's a system that has worked quite well for China. The United States uses a very different system, and there's some incompatibilities between those two systems. The trade negotiations were an attempt to address those, but ultimately they did not. They had a phase one agreement, but it didn't deal with the underlying systemic differences between our countries that led to the trade war in the first place. So trade differences, how our systems interact, that's something that has to be resolved and faced at least during the next administration. Secondly, national security. Our two countries, when we have tried to deal with our economic relationship, have tried to set national security concerns to the side. And that's been the traditional US approach. We try to have an open economy, open for investment, open exports and so on, with a few very special exceptions where you need to get CFIUS approval if you're going to invest in the US, or if you have to get an export license for certain technology. But this was a relatively small part of the economy, and everything else was pretty much open to free trade and free investment. But now there are more and more elements of the economy that have national security implications. And one of the obvious areas of difference between the two countries where this has been manifest has been in 5G networks. 5G networks are very important technology. They do create national security vulnerabilities and offensive capabilities. And it, in both of our countries, would be concerned about that. But it's hard to wall that off from the rest of our economic relationship, because the internet is used as a backbone for so much of our economy. So we have to think in new ways about how to have open economies, but still to deal with national security concerns that now pervade across many, many parts of our economic relationship. So national security is another issue. Another issue has to do with law enforcement. And in the United States, there's a feeling that some Chinese companies and some Chinese individuals haven't been so attentive to US laws. And there's a real drive now in the United States to enforce some of these laws. And this is seen as being targeted against China. So it's creating a lot of. One example is the case of Madam Meng from Huawei. And this is regarded as kind of a symbol of American bullying on the Chinese side. But on the US side, it's regarded as a law enforcement case. And so law enforcement and how this affects our populations is another key area. And then we have human rights and different views about how politics and flows of information and so on should be managed. So that's another area where we're having tensions related to Xinjiang, related to Hong Kong, and other areas. And then finally, there are different views about the COVID pandemic and who's responsible and how we should be working together. So these are major areas where our two governments have different views and where there's been a lot of tension, in fact. And the question is, how will a new administration deal with these questions? The Trump administration has broken a lot of pottery. They've They've said the old way is not working, we're not going to do it that way. And they've approached things from a unilateral point of view, going outside the WTO and so on. But I think there's a general sense that this has not solved the problem. And so I think that if we have a Biden administration, they will probably try some new approaches. It doesn't mean the problems will go away. These will still be a difficult challenge for our governments. But it means that we can expect that the Biden administration probably will try to have a somewhat more consistent approach where different parts of the government are working together to come up with coordinated approaches. I think a Biden administration would probably work more closely with the Biden administration would probably rely more on multilateral approaches, including the WTO, but also including, maybe getting back in the Paris Accord on global climate change and the Iran Accord and so on. So I think we're likely to see very different approaches, but basically the two governments have to put the bilateral relationship back together, recognizing that the old assumptions in the relationship are not necessarily holding true, and that we need to rethink how we deal with both countries from both sides. So I think I would offer that as maybe some introductory comments.
Thank you very much, Tim. Henry, I'm back in the CCG headquarters now.
Yeah.
So with your permission, I will resume the moderation of this morning's very important panel. I think Tim made some very important points, and I think all the issues he raised will need to be faced with by the Chinese government and whoever who will become the next president of the United States. And I think the business communities of both countries and the world at large will need to be very attentive to address these issues. Having said that, personally, I believe China and the United States will be very, very different, and you cannot really want to press for any kind of conformity between the two countries, either politically speaking or in terms of national circumstances. Another point, allow me to emphasize very briefly, is that I do believe that the 5G is coming, and nothing can change the megatrend of technological breakthroughs. I remember in the 1980s, when I worked with Deng Xiaoping, visiting American visitors, the Americans were very eager to sell wheat to China, but they were very hesitant to sell high technologies to China. And Deng Xiaoping used to tease them. They say, wheat can be eaten by Chinese soldiers, so it should also be declared a national security commodity. So you cannot adopt this duality in terms of labeling different things. I would say going forward, probably all the technological breakthroughs will have major national security implications. So what exactly is the nature of China-US relations going forward? That's the key, I think, and that's exactly what we are all gathered here to talk about. Without further ado, allow me to go back to the alphabetical order to give the floor to Mr. Alan Dupont. And we at CCG also thank Hinrich Foundation for co-sponsoring today's panel discussion. Thank you very much. Mr. Dupont, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Victor, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Before I start, I should just say I just discovered that the lights in this room are automatic. If I don't move, they go off. So if I suddenly become dark and I start to throw my hands around, you'll know why, because I need to get the lights going. So I thought I'd just mention that. Okay, so just a little bit of background. I wrote a major paper for the Hinrich Foundation earlier this year, looking at whether we were heading towards a new Cold War. And I looked at US-China rivalry in the context of trade, technology, and geopolitical conflicts. So let me just give you a very concise summary of the key findings, and I'll make some observations about some of the other themes we're going to discuss later this morning. So the key question is, has the linked US-China trade, technology, and geopolitical conflicts, have they actually precipitated a new Cold War? And my answer to that is definitely yes. Having said that, there are, of course, differences with the first Cold War. And if I could just summarize them as really China has supplanted Russia as the main threat in US eyes, and strategic competition between the US and the Soviet Union, as we recall, largely played out into the political and military domains. There was little trade between the two competing blocs. But the main contest between the US and China is obviously in the economic domain, which means that trade, investment, technology, and strategic industries are central to today's rivalry. Now, if you recall again, the GDP of the Soviet Union was only about 40% of that of the US at the height of the First Cold War, but China's is already at 60%. Between them, and this is the key point, the US and China account for around 40% of global GDP. So if either of these two titans sneeze, the rest of the world catches a cold. Literally in the case of China, as the impact of the coronavirus has continued to lay waste to the health and prosperity of millions. So there are differences, but the similarities are more striking and more relevant. And I'll summarize them as really 6 points that I think are commonalities with the First World War. And the first one is that US-China rivalry is between the world's two most powerful states, but one is a liberal democracy and the other is avowedly communist. So it's certainly authoritarian. Second, it is a system-wide contest for supremacy. It's not just between the US and China, it's systemic. Third, it is about values as well as power. Just as the First Cold War was, it was essentially an ideological conflict. This is becoming, unfortunately, one as well. Fourth, I think it will be a multi-decade struggle for global ascendancy. Fifth, a second geopolitical bifurcation of the world is likely. And sixth, neither side wants a full-scale military confrontation. In short, it's not your run-of-the-mill great power conflict. I use the Cold War analogy advisedly because I still think a simmering rivalry is more likely than a hot war. But this is hardly cause for relief or complacency. I believe that a second Cold War could be worse than the first, given the interdependence of the US and Chinese economies, their centrality to global prosperity, and the proliferation of dangerous military and cyber technologies. A worsening of the US-China trade and tech wars could reduce international cooperation, reinforce protectionist tendencies, and open new fronts of conflict and contestation. It could also complicate global economic recovery after the ravages of the coronavirus and lay the seeds for a second global recession or even depression. An extended period of great power competition between the US and China would risk the gains from more than 70 years of trade liberalization, disrupt global supply chains, perhaps even balkanize the internet and divide the world into two mutually incompatible political systems. But having said that, with Taiwan and the South China Sea, the most likely triggers for military conflict between the two major powers, even though both of them know the risk and neither wants to have that conflict. The core reason, in my view, for the deterioration in relations between the US and China is that both are now wrestling for strategic advantage in an increasingly bitter contest for global leadership. Beijing thinks Washington is bent in containing China to prolong declining American power while denying China its rightful place in the sun. Americans increasingly believe that Beijing is threatening US security interests, undermining its prosperity, interfering in its democracy, and challenging its values. Anti-China sentiment unites an otherwise divided and partisan Washington. So no matter how cleverly spun, I don't believe a trade deal is going to get the relationship back on track, even if it occurs, because both countries have moved from a framework of cooperation to one of open rivalry and strategic competition. Diminished trust, different worldviews, the systemic nature of their confrontation, and domestic politics all present significant challenges that will need to be overcome in order to avoid the worst case outcomes of the new Cold War. Now, let me make some very brief comments on the 4 topics we've been asked to address in this webinar, which my co-speakers will unpack and discuss in more detail. Are there likely to be any substantial changes to China policy under a new US administration? I don't think so. If Donald Trump wins next Tuesday, I anticipate a further hardening of US-China policy. If Biden wins, he's unlikely to reverse the direction of Trump's policies, and there could be additional tensions over human rights. So it's difficult to see a circuit breaker anytime soon to the downward spiral in relations, certainly on the US side. Similarly, I'm not optimistic that Xi Jinping is in the mood to make significant concessions on any of the major points of tension. Indeed, he may double down on his pushback against the US and assert China's newly acquired global power and influence. Are the US and China destined to decouple? I believe they are, but the extent of that decoupling is still unclear. I don't think the US and China are still joined at the hip in so many ways, but selective or managed decoupling is unavoidable and is already occurring, principally in the tech arena. So what would be the likely impact on trade and technology? My concern is that tech decoupling will spread to all areas of the US-China relationship, including education, trade, business, which will further disrupt global supply chains already upended by the pandemic, as well as financial flows and geopolitics. So to conclude, although a worsening of their rivalry is likely in the short term, at some point, both countries will have to re-engage constructively because it is in their interest to do so, just as the US and Soviet Union did at the height of the First Cold War. So let me end there on that relatively optimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. This is really a very sobering remark you've made, and I think I personally listened to that very carefully with full attention, and I hope the real situation playing out in the coming 4 years will be a little bit more positive, and that gives us hope to listen to the next distinguished speaker, Miss Mary Lovely, and I hope Miss Mary Lovely's presentation and forecast of the future will be more lovely in a sense. And I think it is this kind of diversity of views and different views focusing on different facets of this very complicated relations between our 2 great countries that gives excitement and gives reason for hope or less hope. So let's see what Ms. Mary Lovely has to inform us 5 days before the momentous day in the presidential election. Thank you. You have the floor, please.
Dr. Wang, for having me back. I always enjoy these dialogues. Yes, first of all, I want to thank not only CCG, but also the Hinrich Foundation for funding this and making this possible. I think that these dialogues are exactly the type of interchange that we need to avoid the continuing downward spiral in relations. I have to agree with Mr. Gao and say that Alan Dupont's comments were quite sobering and scary. And I'm torn between this view that America thinks that there's going to be conformity between the 2 countries, which Victor mentioned, and Alan's statement that we're headed toward a hot war. That's quite a huge span. I don't think that any of this is very, that it's predetermined. I think that we have to recognize that President Trump was in some sense sui generis. He was a one-off, we hope, and at least I personally do, because I think he's been quite destructive of US international relations. But even if he is not, we have to admit that this has been a unique period. And even if he has a second term, it would be a unique period. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that things can be put back together easily. As Timothy said, there's been a lot of pottery broken. So we do need to think about what has happened. But let me just say, I don't really find the Cold War analogy that useful, because I think there are, as Alan said, there are similarities, but there are also important differences. And I think a very important difference is that China and the United States are much more integrated with each other than the US ever was with Russia. Alan mentioned this, but I think it's a reason why both countries would hesitate before pushing toward even hotter confrontation. Is deeply integrated with the rest of the world. If you remember, the world was really bifurcated between the Western axis and the Soviet axis. And this is not the case today. In fact, many countries with whom US is an ally have higher trade share with China than they do with the United States. So it's not going to be easy for the United States to just say, okay, just take all your toys and go home. I don't think that's going to happen. There's just too much there. Let's add in the important role of multinational corporations, which fundamentally underpin the relationship between US and China. 60% of the trade between the United States and China, at least US imports, are coming from foreign invested enterprises operating in China. Many US companies earn a large share of their profits in China. Meanwhile, China is also dependent on the United States and has even in this recent meeting of the Central Committee, we've had the reaffirmation of the role of foreign investment in China. And a role not only for bringing technology, but for helping China to reach the next phase of its development. So I think there's many reasons to think that we need to kind of put the brakes on this Cold War rhetoric and think about how we can overcome some of the problems that have really been exacerbated over the last 4 years. First, I think it's going to be very hard to return US-China commercial relations to their previous state. This is Tim's pottery breaking, I think. Tariffs average about 20%. 2/3 of our exports to you, or US exports to China, Chinese exports to the US. We've seen the destruction of markets. US farms, for example, spent more than 20 years cultivating their that's been swept away. We have the US placing increasingly restrictive, and may I add, erratic export controls on sales to China that the rest of the world has had to navigate. We have tightened screening on Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States, restrictions on visas, and then, of course, retaliation by China and threats against US citizens. So we're seeing very negative, not only actions, but also dialogue. So it's hard to see how we can break this cycle, but I think that the election may be exactly what could do it. I have to say also that China has not, unfortunately, bought itself much goodwill in the United States with the Phase 1 agreement, something that we might have hoped would have happened. The purchase commitments were always highly unrealistic. They're way behind. Phase 2 is not going to happen, is my view. There's really no basis of trust for the two countries to create some kind of negotiated settlement to these very difficult issues like the role of state enterprises, state subsidies, national security issues. So I think we're going to have some kind of decoupling. The question is, how deep will that decoupling be, and whether it will stay just in a similar types of live and let live, or if it will go in the opposite direction, the direction which Alan sketched out for us. I think that to think about this, we might want to think about how a Joe Biden administration might be different than a Donald Trump administration. And I think that the clear indication, and here Joe Biden doesn't have a lot in his statements about actual trade policy, but we might think that, of course, he'll turn to the domestic economy for 2021. He has to. The US is still having very high rates of COVID infection. entire year. But we have to believe that he will reinvigorate with the allies. And while this many people paint as joining with the allies to confront China, actually China has been at the WTO. It's clear looking at the statement on state subsidies that was put together by the trilateral statement by the US, Japan, and the European Union, that it's not something that China is going to be able to accept immediately, but it may be the basis for some negotiation. So there is some possibility here that we could get the WTO functioning again and provide at least some basis for negotiation. We also know that a Biden administration is going to be more sympathetic to subsidies for industrial policy purposes itself. So it may want to dial a bit back on that. In contrast, President Trump's industrial policy has been almost entirely tariffs. So there you have it. One is, a hammer, and one might have some sweetener in it, which is, hey, let's put some disciplines on these subsidies, but otherwise try not to destroy the gains from trade. So what are the keys to de-risking the US-China relations? I think, first of all, we need to restart strategic dialogues. Actions by both sides, and I include making it increasingly difficult for us to have dialogues. It's increasingly difficult for me to talk with my academic colleagues. It's increasingly difficult for me to do research with my academic colleagues. So we need to restart dialogues at all levels of society to get this thing back on. Secondly, I think we should look for some easy wins, maybe through the WTO. For example, it's been hard to get China on board fully with fishery subsidies, controlling, disciplining fishery subsidies. There are some things at the WTO, some reforms that could be made where both sides, for example, we could all agree on a director general, which we know the US is just serving as a blocker today when it blocked a very qualified Nigerian from becoming the next director general. So I think these easy wins could begin to build confidence. I think we also need to recognize areas of mutual dependence and of mutual vulnerability. So in this sense, we may have to agree on some areas of decoupling. I think 5G is going to be one where we're going to see decoupling, and then we need to contain the effect of that. What does that mean? How are we still going to have commercial relations and have this type of civil dialogue? So there's so many layers to the relationship that need attention. And I think it all starts with strategic dialogue. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mary Lovely. I think it gives me personally better reason to hope for the next 4 years coming. However, I think both perspectives are equally important because we need to be more balanced in our views as well as in how we look forward to whatever that is coming, either out of Washington or out of Beijing, and how the two can really engage with each other. Without further ado, let's go to the next speaker. But before that, may I remind our audience that they can use the question button to send questions to our CCG staff, and eventually we can gather all the questions together when we start the Q&A session. There is a question button, I think, so you can submit your questions anytime at your leisure. Mr. Shi Yinghong does not need. Now, Henry mentioned his background. He's very distinguished. He knows the China policy very well. He's very much involved in China's policy decision-making, if I may say so, or at least in an advisory point of view. And I think we will benefit from Mr. Shi's perspective and analysis and forecast of what's going to happen. Mr. Shi, you have the floor for up to 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And it's my great honor to be here to discuss with so distinguished experts and from outside China, and with my distinguished colleagues in China. And I would like to focus my talk on a not so difficult prediction. And I will talk about so-called trends of China-US relations after election. And I will divide my talk into two parts. The first part is so-called pros and cons of Joe Biden as US president from a Chinese perspective. And this is my personal point of view. The second part is probable differences in my eyes between the Trump president and the Biden presidency in terms of US behavior toward China. So first, what will be the plus, in my point of view, of Joe Biden as US president? First, a probable different fundamental objective about China, different from that of Trump administration since April this year. That is to force China return to Deng Xiaoping or return to a less centralization of power, rather than like Trump, subverting and eliminating communist power in China. And this is a very big difference, but with a great reservation. In eyes of a top leader, this is not so difficult to persuade after April this year. Second, and this is very clear to at least to Chinese scholars, Biden Harris are far from wild, far from vulgar and volatile as Trump has been. So I expect it to bring more credibility to US policy toward China, and therefore to the corresponding stability of bilateral relations. So I firmly believe that Biden as US president and the Democratic administration will worry much more the possibility of major military conflict with China or any military conflict with China. And also that the President Biden would pay more attention to US-China diplomatic communication and dialogue at a higher level, or to reverse de facto diplomatic decoupling between two countries. And since the much of this year, and or since I also believe that the President Biden will oppose high tariff warfare against China, as he repeatedly said during campaign, and regarding it too damaging to American companies and American consumers. And also I believe that he will commit in principle, as China does, though in practice, probably also like China, much less so than Europeans. But also, of course, there will be cons. First, there will be no significant difference for a Biden-Harris administration from that of Trump over the major issues of Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea, Xinjiang, Tibet, China's religious situation, and China's human rights situation, and even over the issue of Tibet and the religious situation in China and the human rights situation in China. And it's probable that the Biden administration will do even more hawkish and things toward China than Trump administration. The second, the high-tech decoupling from China and the law enforcement actions against China of its claimed subversive will continue in a similar intensity. Third, and this is talk about worldwide, and he will repel in remarkable degree US allied relationship in both Europe and Asian Pacific. So making a Western, so-called united front against China, a more solid reality in all terms. Pay so less attention around the world and even more around China. But I believe that part of the radical wing of Democrats. So President Biden have to appeasing its demand, radical demand within the Democratic Party about China in various degrees on the fundamental objectives, US-China diplomatic communication, and principal commitment to global governance and multilateralism. And on these important issues area, I believe Democratic radicals are no big difference from Republican populists. And also, President Biden have to appeasing in a major degree the so grassroots whites or Trump's electorate if the Democrat administration wants to heal a highly divided United States left by Trump. Finally, and there is the obligation to continue to implement the various legal sanctions against China already made by Trump and by US Congress in almost unanimous manner. Second part of our talk, probable difference between the Trump presidency and Biden one in terms of US behavior toward China. Under Trump presidency, there will be increasing danger of military confrontation or even limited conflict in the western part of Western Pacific between Beijing and Washington. The second, there will be stronger squeeze against China for enormous increase of US export to China and maintaining or even increase of high tariffs imposed on China's export to the United States. There will be more legal sanctions. And so there will be escalation of law enforcement action against the claimed subversion, penetration, intelligence activity in the United States by China. There will be acceleration of high-tech decoupling from China. And there will be almost non-existence of US-China cooperation in principle on global governance and global multilateralism. There will be severe arms race between the United States and China, almost all across the region. Finally, there might be possible or even probable boycott of Beijing Winter Olympic to be held in 2022. Though the Biden administration, if Biden would win election, could or might take the same boycott action. Under Biden presidency, I firmly believe there will be sooner or later renegotiation of US-China trade agreement in the direction of reducing the too huge amount of US export forced on China and making it somewhat compatible with China's real demand implementation. And there will be reduction substantially the amount and the rate of Chinese export to the United States, which has been imposed with high tariffs by Trump administration. There will be probable launching of phase 2 trade negotiation, whatever the name, sooner or later, on structural changes on the Chinese side, the intention of which was virtually abandoned by Trump administration after April this year. There will be higher leveled and earlier diplomatic dialogue or even negotiation with China for partial mitigation of bilateral high tension. There will be much less possibility of US-China military conflict due on US side to much less military posture toward China and more communication for crisis prevention and crisis management. and arms race with China could be mitigated if China could slow the pace of strategic military buildup. Finally, there will be step-by-step restoration of US-China cooperation in principle on climate change, civil cyber security, and anti-terrorism, and even combat against the COVID pandemic. Though in concrete practice, the results could be quite limited. And thus I finish my talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Shi. I hope you do have a crystal ball in your palm, and whatever you have presented to this panel will be very much in line with what's going to happen. Thank you very much. I think it's very important to size up President Trump as the next president versus President Biden as the next president. But one thing for sure, I've been saying recently that if President Biden goes to the office, I think the United States will need to rejoin the climate change accord. And I've been appealing the next president to at least do that and demonstrate once again the US leadership in the world to do the right thing, at least in terms of climate change. What else? Let's be very focused on sizing up what's going to happen. Next, let us give the floor to Professor Teng Jianqun to talk about how he looks at these very, very momentous topics, very important topics. Professor Teng, you have the floor for up to 8 minutes. You need to turn on the mic, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And all right.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be here to talk about Sino-US relation at this moment. I think the current tension or current situation between the two sides actually is not only a result of security, trade, it's actually a result of rebalancing power between the two countries. The old balanced power between China and the United States has been or is being changed in recent days, and we are now in a new process of rebalancing the relations between the two sides. So this is actually a development of the two countries in its comprehensive power, and so it's very important for China and for the United States to think about what the future relations between the two sides. So I'd like to mention several, points. First, the United States in recent days actually has already taken China as a strategic competitor, especially from Trump's NSSR issued on December 18, 2017. This is actually a milestone for the relations between the two countries. In this report, the United States, for the first time since the two countries established these diplomatic relations in 1979, has taken China as a real strategic competitor and international revisionist. So under such circumstances, we have witnessed the sudden changes in the relation between the two sides. And in recent days, we repeatedly heard the complaint from a Secretary of State about the ideology, the communism or Marxism, something like that, to the challenge, to challenge the so-called free world, and especially during his speech in July this year in Nixon Library. So this is actually ideology-oriented policy toward China by the United States, especially by some politicians in the Trump's administration. And under such circumstances, the policy toward China, I think, good for the two countries. For example, the secretary would like to manipulate such a situation for the own sake for the United States to have a strategic competition with China. And I'm sure Secretary of State would like to unify the so-called free world to confront China together, to win such a strategic competition between the two sides. So this is actually a very ideological perspective to China, and this led to the tension to the relations between the two sides. This is not a security. This is not a trade. This is actually an ideological competition between the two sides. But I don't think China will follow the suit, as our state mentioned, that China will not follow the suit of the United States, follow the step of the United States. China will, give direct response to any provocative actions from the US side. So this is our policy. I just returned from Guangdong province yesterday. I talked to officials in the government and talked to officers in the military. I think they're all very confident in dealing with any provocation from the US side, especially in the South China Sea, in Taiwan issue. They all said they have been well prepared to deal with any, provocative actions by the US, especially in military in the South China Sea. So I think today, China has become more and more confident in this regard. And this is actually a dilemma for China and the United States. How can we, find a way out of such a dilemma, especially in the South China Sea and in Taiwan, because the two sides, both, I think, are very confident in dealing with each other in these issues. And I think the Chinese side is confident, and the United States would like to, go forward in this area to put some pressure on China. And so such a dilemma just gave us a very crucial moment to think about the future. To my understanding, the two sides, especially the two leaders from the two countries, are quite familiar with current situation. As for the United States, to our understanding, to Chinese scholars' understanding, actually some politicians would like to manipulate such a situation. For example, Taiwan issue, and Trump administration has already did several rounds of arms to Taiwan. It's not for the sake of the Taiwan, local people, but for the sake of the United States. It's one part of the so-called strategic competition with China, and China, as our colleague just mentioned, would like to give strong response to these actions by the United States. So this is another round of competition or rebalancing of power between the two sides. In my opinion, I think even no matter who will be the next president of the United States, Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, that will not change the current posture of so-called competition between the two sides, because the perspective from the US side toward China actually has been there. Even the ordinary people, they worried about the future, the development of China. They would like to continue such a dominant position in the world, and they would like to unify some so-called free world to confront China. So I think no matter, no, I think the coming leader of the United States after the vote early next month will not change the current development or the perspective of the United States toward China. And on the other side, I think Chinese people or the Chinese government or Chinese leaders will adopt a new, perspective toward the United States in military, in ideology, in trade, in security, and in regional cooperation or in international cooperation. This is actually a new stage for the two sides to think about their policy toward each other, and China will echo to the changes of the U.S. policy toward China or the U.S. international policy. So at this moment, I think China actually Chinese are thinking about the new policy toward the United States, but I don't think China or the United States can afford the price of so-called decoupling of the two countries. This is actually a high price for the two sides. And if you look at the trade, last year, even we were facing the trade friction between the two sides. The total amount of trade reached 442 billion US dollars. Such a great amount of trade. How can you in trade, in technology, in some other corporations? This is actually only unilateral perspective toward China by some U.S. politicians. I don't think such a mentality will give any positive, development in the relationship between the two sides, and also any, positive impact on the future of the two countries. So I think I'm not so pessimistic about the relations between the two sides in the future, because this is time of globalization. We have to find a way out of such a dilemma in security, in trade, in every aspect. Don't manipulate the worries of the public in China and in the United States for some sake of some specific groups of interest. This is not good for China, and not good for the United States, and not good for the relations between the two sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tang. I think you presented a perspective of reason and soundness, I think. And let's see how our panel will completely unfold and how the Q&A sessions will proceed. At least we will give the floor to Henry. A couple of very brief points in my own capacity, because once Henry Wang speaks, I need to shut up because he will exhaust all the good points to start with. So the first point I want to make is to decouple between China and the United States. Now, what are you talking about? Are you talking about complete decouple or partial decouple? If it is complete decouple, cutting off every and any relations between China and the United States will suffer probably more than China will suffer. So is anyone really with the soundness of the mind in Washington want to achieve that? I think they probably want to have the cake and eat it. They want to have the so-called partial decouple. They want to refuse to sell China things that China needs, but then they want to engage China as an export market as much as possible. So that will be indulging in fantasy. If you want to have a decouple, let's have a complete decouple and see how will that serve the interest of the American people. More recently, I've been asked the question a lot whether Biden will be more tougher than Trump against China. I've emphasized that the real test is not whether you are being tough on China or not. The real test is whether being tough on China really serves the fundamental interest of the American people. So if being tough on China will not serve the fundamental interest of the American people, then being tough on China may be the wrong attitude. That's number one. Number two is that I would say complete decouple will be suicidal to America as well as to China. The second thing is competition. US has labeled China as a competitor. I think competition is part of life. You know, you cannot get away or get rid of competition at all. So if the United States is afraid of competition from China, why? I've coined the term Tonya Harding syndrome. I think the United States or some people in Washington is guilty of this Tonya Harding syndrome. They want to kill competition, like whacking the kneecap of Nancy Kerrigan. And that's not good for China. It's not good for the United States. And the third point, very briefly, what do people in Washington really believe they can hold China down without consequence? No, I don't think so. Now, the fourth point, very briefly, which gives me reason to be confident about the medium and longer term prospect of China-US relations, is that I think we need to focus also on the time dynamic in China-US relations. I think there are people in Washington who are very much agitated about China-US relations because they cannot live with the prospect that eventually China will be a larger economy, more impactful as it is today. But the real question is whether a larger China or smaller China will really constitute a threat to the United States. I think China can be larger than the United States, but China does not need to be a threat. I think China and the United States really need to sit down and talk about how China today or China 10 years later or China 15 years later will not really make it more difficult for the United States. China and the United States need to get along with each other one way or another. That's my very brief comment before we have the floor given to Henry Wang to make his very important remark on these very important topics. Thank you, Henry. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Victor, and also thank again our distinguished panelists, and also thank Hinrich Foundation for co-hosting this very timely webinar. And appreciate all your contributions. What I think the topic today is really relevant, and what I personally think is that now we are the 2020 will go down in history as probably as a landmark year that really has the world shifted on different focus quite a bit in terms of making people reflect what went wrong and what can be done. I agree that Alan mentioned about there's a more risk now. There's probably even a hot war danger possibly, and Mary talked about even the Cold War or decouple. It's not like Soviet Union days. It's quite a quite complex 21st century issue. So what I was thinking is that now internationally, international community, we are really lacking a kind of a comprehensive or maybe more understandable narrative. We are really using the old way of either US or China. Maybe we are still find the old way of traditional thinking or thoughts that really dealing with the 21st century reality, and that's really where the challenges are. For example, if you talk about China, if it's really as the old traditional 20th century theory, if it's run by one party, then this one party must be really, if there's no competition, and then that all the problem associated with it. But on the contrary, see, China actually has developed quite a different model now, or governance system. You have a consultative democracy. It has really, China has experienced the market democracy, a technology democracy. Everybody, 1 billion smartphone users are voting every day. There's a social media monitoring China on the grassroots basis. China is living in the international community of 200 countries, and U.S. is the largest opposition party for China. So you see, China wasn't really the days of old days that mountain is high and emperor is far away and everybody's autocratic and they make decisions on their own judgment. Collective decision. It's a very scientific decision process. And so, that big data, all those things. So China is embraced the globalization international community. China is making all the, largely right position. Wi-Fi, China needs to come up with some new narrative. How has this done right? For example, lifting 800 million people out of poverty, and break the history record of become the second largest economy in 4 decades. So if we talk about China contributing more than 1/3 of the world GDP growth, become the largest trading nation with 130 countries, something must be right for China. Of course, China our policy has gained a lot of support, a lot of multinational operations in China. Everybody contributes, like multinational employees and contribute also 20% of Chinese GDP development possibly. And so that narrative never really well spoken, I think both internationally and in China. So theory still in the back mind of many people, but doesn't really hold true anymore. On the contrary, we see, the Western system, of course, it's been really doing well for since Second World War, particularly in the early years, 60s, 70s, 80s, when technology was not developed, when market was not developed, when globalization was not that developed. One man, one vote really is the best way to settle all the differences. But now you see, this kind of system may not be really functional with social media, with this kind of problem. We see every country experience every 4 years, and then there's total repudiation of the predecessor, and then start over again. There's a lot of a waste in that, So even people really, some people prefer that kind of system, but efficiency where it is, maybe it's very democratic, but then you cannot get things done. That's also a problem. So I think the world come to the stage now, to this year now, we really see the pandemic is really a good example of that. It has happened in China. It attacked China first. China quickly put it under control. China now everywhere you go is as normal, and business is booming, everything, life back to normal. But look at the other, democratic society, then everybody has a different opinion, and that's really. So we probably have to give China some credit, but also I think there's some combination of the two. The Western system has marriage as well. There's a chance to explain and also maybe to develop a new narrative, rather than the Soviet Union type of communist China, on China. So I think, fundamentally is that we really need a new narrative, both for China and internationally, to explain better of both positions. Only if we have done that, we can probably be a bit tolerant of a different system. We can have a bit healthy competition among us. We can really seek the biggest commonality among us, rather than we are focused on a little difference or maybe some difference we have, and maximize it and really scare people out of that, and then make it decoupled. So that's my very brief analysis. I think that for 2020 is the year that make people to think, and also amongst the pandemic, we can see how this different country operates. China, the population in China give a very high ratings for the government performance, And China this year, 2020, China is still going to reach the target of lifting extreme poverty, achieve that objective. So those are really a big contribution to the world. I think if China prospers, if China is not becoming North Korea or becoming another Iran, I mean, China is probably a blessing if it's developed well, and if it's well developed and well fed, of course. And so you know, we shouldn't really worry about too much, because China never sent any a big expedition or conquer any country or invaded any country in the past 4 decades. So I think that we need a new narrative. As far as the U.S. president election next 4 years is concerned, I think I'm really a bit optimistic. I think things probably will get a little better, because for President Trump, if he wins, he has no pressure of bashing China again, because the first time he bashing China, he's really delivered his campaign promise. He's really appealing the voters to re-vote him again for the second term. If he got the second term, he probably will return more back to American first. He will really try to expand American business interests. He's a business background. So probably in that sense, he will continue his phase 2 and his phase 3. And he probably will less so really attacking China, the President Xi at the beginning of his term. But I worry about the team he may have. You know, maybe more West Point graduates, maybe more hawkish people and things like that. So that maybe, but certainly will be probably better than the current term, because really bashing China and the election season, China is always very, very hot issue, and always all the previous president election, China is on top of the agenda. So I think hopefully, you know, second term will be better. As far as President hope for Biden is concerned, I think that he will certainly have a better time with President Trump. The reason for that is very simple. He wants to assert U.S. leadership in the Western world. He wants to get allies united, you know, confronting or maybe dealing with China. But he also wants to pursue multilateralism, right? I mean, for example, he already pledged coming back to the Paris Accord. He pledged $2 billion to invest in that. So if you're doing Paris Accord, President Xi already said, let's get China already set objective for that, 2060 carbon neutralized. That's exactly can work with the U.S., the 2 largest emission country in the world. So they have to work with China. I mean, you know, the John Kerry told me at the Munich Security Conference early this year, that it's the U.S. actually persuaded China set a target for the climate change, and China has actually got to get along with that. And now I'm sure Biden will do it again, because that was Biden administration did that. So second, he wants to reform WHO. I mean, China is committed $2 billion US dollars supporting the WHO and developing country fight against COVID-19. I'm sure US wants to come back on that. So again, there's another platform for China to talk with US. Thirdly, Biden wants to reform WTO. And again, China is the largest trading nation among the member of the WTO. We have another channel to talk. And fourthly, you know, Biden may come back, has expressed interest to join TPP. So we see 4 or 5 avenues that China and the US can talk. I agree that we heard before that strategic dialogue is really a great way to go. So as long as we see each other face to face, as long as we actually have dialogues, I'm sure that will greatly mitigate the risk of having a war, I mean, on South China Sea or Taiwan, whatever. So I think, you know, that's my assessment of Biden administration. Even though the Biden may not be happy about the human rights or the Hong Kong issues or Tibet or Xinjiang, but let's look at the reality. You know, Hong Kong is now back to normal. Hong Kong now is going to have the largest IPO in the world. Hong Kong business community, the whole people in Hong Kong are very satisfied now, and that Xinjiang is having all the you know, highest growth in the history of Xinjiang. And so if we see all those things stabilized and get better, I'm sure they will realize the US model is not a perfect model. China may have some merits in terms of getting 1.4 billion people and a great development. And so, you know, after all, we are living in the 21st century. I mean, decouple is totally impossible. You may see the tree leaves falling off, but the roots are totally connected. It cannot separate. If you cut the roots off, you know, the tree is dying. I mean, the world is going to really in chaotic or recession. So I think that, you know, unfortunately, there's election politics going on. And, but also I think that China, I mean, still stick to the open door policy. I was giving some talks in yesterday interview on 14th five-year plan. China still wants to open up, and you know, that's a Hainan, Shenzhen. China is going to Pudong again. So I think that with all those things, if we as a think tank community, I think the Hinrich Foundation, this report is really great. It's stimulating a lot of good discussions. We hope that we can. You know, working towards the better future. I mean, at least that's our, you know, think tank community can probably do, and the CCG can do to really do our best to stabilize that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. All these points are well taken. And before we move to the Q&A session, which will cover the last 30 minutes of our panel discussion today, we still have about 12 minutes. And allow me to make another very brief point. I think 41 years ago, China was locked up in this huge box. China at that time believed that socialism was definitely superior to capitalism. And we were really engaged in this hair splitting as to what was socialism, what was capitalist. And eventually, China got lost in locking itself up. I think it reminds me of Washington today. Washington seems to be locked up in this huge box, arguing about the Chinese way versus the American way, etc. Allow me to emphasize one point. I think, you know, we all have some belief in our own faith, and it's always your God for you and my God for me. If you really argue about what is the true God, etc., then mankind will be torn apart. So I think what saved China is really socialism with Chinese characteristics. I would propose that decision makers capitalism with American characteristics, come up with your own way of doing things, which may be better than the Chinese way of doing things, etc. But don't impose your way onto the Chinese way, and don't expect that China will need to give up its way of doing things in favor of the American way, because otherwise you will be ossified. You will really 41 years ago, we were really locked up in this huge box. And it gives me no surprise to see all these extreme positions taken by many politicians or think tanks in Washington, because it is not something new. We did that before and we lost in that great battle. Now, the second point, very briefly, is that China today, and I hope Americans will really take great delight in this, China does not export a political national order. It does not want to export an ideology. China does not have a faith or religion to export at all. China just wants to do business with everyone. And for China to hear someone want to contain China or decouple from China, you really do not know what you are talking about. You do not know the size and the magnitude and the depth of China as a population, as a civilization, as a landmass, for example. No, talking about containing China, you are not talking about containing Fiji, for example, or Samoa. You are talking about containing China, the 1.4 billion people. So really ridicule as far as Beijing is concerned, hearing such extreme views as if you really believe your God is better than mine, you really believe your faith is superior than mine, this will be a recipe for a lot of trouble going forward. So let's get along, let's engage with each other as equals, let's respect each other. I think that's the very, very important thing. And what's happening in Paris and in France in terms of the religious extremism should also remind us that there are important international challenges that all the countries need to engage with together. We need to pool our resources together to fight off all these dangerous forces. China is a victim of many of these dangerous forces to start with. Having said that, Q&A session, and I expect more questions to come in as we move into the Q&A session. There are three major questions. One is by Andrew Leong. Is asking how US-China tensions over the South China Sea and Taiwan are likely to play out in the coming US administration, focusing on South China Sea. Anyone who want to take a first shot at this question?
I might have a first go at that then.
Thank you. Thank you,
just say a few quick words about that.
Alex.
So I think the point about Taiwan and the South China Sea is that these are potential triggers for between the US and China, which nobody wants to see, but we have to contemplate because we have to think through the consequences of that and how that might play out. Now, in many ways, Taiwan is the bellwether of relations between the US and China. When relations are good, Taiwan is sort of in the background. When things are not going so well, it's very much in the foreground as it is at the moment. And I suppose the concern from the US side is that China, that President Xi Jinping would see an opportunity now of Taiwan with the mainland. That can probably only come about through the use of China's political, economic, and military power. Now, the question in the minds of the US is, will China do it? President Xi has talked about this in admittedly peripheral terms, but it's left the impression that China might do something sooner rather than later. From China's point of view, of course, the US has been provocative by supplying weapons to Taiwan, etc. So is that whoever wins the US election is going to have to remain committed to Taiwan for political and geopolitical reasons. And so there is a real likelihood that tensions over Taiwan are going to increase quite dramatically. And that is very dangerous because it could bring the US military and the Chinese military into direct conflict. The South China Sea is a lesser order issue, but there is still the potential for conflict there. And I don't believe a Biden administration would pull back from the current US position on the South China Sea, which is not to recognize China's claim to 90% of the South China Sea. So that's going to be a standoff that could get worse. But Taiwan, to me, is the real issue, the critical issue. And when I talked previously a little bit about the potential for a hot war, I don't think it's going to happen. But if it were to happen, I think most likely it would be over Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Alan. Very well said.
I would like to say a few words, 2 points. And about the situation of Taiwan and the United States and between Beijing and Taipei. Past 1 month, immediately since the 37 Chinese fighters to fly over so-called the middle line of Taiwan Strait. Until now, 1 month. And you see there's almost no new, flying over the middle lines. You see no, so-called 四海联动, the several seas, same time to military drills by PLA. You almost see no, for 1 month, past 1 month, there's the frequent and military and ships, sometimes with Chinese made the aircraft carrier to go around or in Taiwan Island. On Taiwanese side, and same prudence in the past months. And Taiwan have not to even to escalate the level of precautions and so on. This point, very important. In the past months, Taiwan situation suddenly become relatively quiet. a firm believer of so-called cross-reasoning logical violence. Everything comes from interaction. So I think that for the potential danger of military conflict over Taiwan and over South China Sea, and even potential military conflict danger over East China Sea, I firmly believe the dynamism on the Chinese side is as strong as on American side. So both sides, if we want to prevent a military conflict between Washington and Beijing, both sides have to revise, adjust their major approaches over these issue areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Teng, Professor Teng.
In terms of Taiwan, I'd like to say this is actually a very sensitive issue between China and the United States. As recently, the Trump's administration has enhanced its manipulation of this issue, including sending of cabinet members to Taiwan to give more advanced military equipment to Taiwan. This is actually one part of the U.S. competition strategy toward China. So I think China actually gave a very strong response, including large scale of military drills. And you know, since early 1990s, Chinese military has adopted the so-called strategy to wage a war on the high tech in the southeast coast of China. I'm sure that the PRA has been well prepared to meet any military challenge from the United States, from Taiwan this time. But this is the last resort for the Chinese government. I don't think at this moment the Chinese leaders would like to go that way. In terms of the South China Sea, I don't think there is any problem in so-called freedom of navigation. This is actually another battlefield for the two countries to compete in military. And to my knowledge, the U.S. military, is very cautious in this regard, and the Chinese military is very cautious, but they all very confident in dealing with each other. So this is actually a dilemma for China and the United States. It's not a military issue, it's actually a political issue. Find a way out of such a dilemma. The U.S. has been worried about the control of the South China Sea because of its Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think, to my knowledge, as a former naval junior officer in the PRA Navy, I always argued the military-to-military exchanges between the two countries, between China and the United States, was initiated early, in 1980s, have been, confronting each other, and this is not a military issue. In my opinion, this is a political issue. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, any other feedback, any other contribution? Allow me to make some very brief remarks. I think either a confrontation or conflict involving either Taiwan or the South China Sea between China and the United States will be a very, very big disaster. And I don't think US can afford to lose. And I don't think China can afford to lose. So you are talking really about very rapid escalation from a small skirmish, for example, in conventional sphere, out of control, way rapidly all the way up to MAD. So you are really talking about a potential catastrophe which may engulf both the Chinese nation and the American people. So any decision maker, either in Beijing or in Washington, really need to ponder this war or peace issue between our two countries involving South China Sea or Taiwan or anything else, because I don't think it will be very much limited to conventional warfare. It may soon get out of control. And eventually you are talking about really staring at each other's eye to see who will blink first. And then you are talking about a completely changed landscape in the world. So we need to be very, very serious as think tanks, as scholars, as decision makers in advising our government how to economies in the world, and also between the two largest military forces in the world, both armed to the teeth in terms of nuclear weapons. This is no child's play. This is not something left to amateurs. This is really talking about what's fundamentally at stake between China and the United States. The total length of the province of Gansu from east to west, about 1,600 kilometers. I would say President Xi Jinping is right, at least on one thing, that is this sense of one China, this sense of reunification of China is deeply embedded in the Chinese genes and the DNA. Because over the centuries, China was divided, fragmented, eventually it coalesced again to become a unified country. So I think Washington not only need to decide what to do regarding Taiwan or South China Sea as of now, but they also need to think about in terms of 100 years, 1,000 years, or 5,000 years going forward. You do not want to do something which will condemn eternally in the Chinese history, going forward another century or another 1,000 years as the evildoer try to split China apart and try to stand in the way against Chinese reunification, because whatever the situation, China eventually will coalesce into one unified country. That's a very, very important thing. And for South China Sea, I think stability and calm and enabling all the neighboring countries to develop peacefully and in greater stability will be the key. And I don't think anyone who wants to really increase the anxiety and the tension in the South China Sea will serve its own purpose or serve anyone else around the South China Sea region. This is very, very important. So if I have a bet, I will bet on peace and stability in the South China Sea. I will bet on the eventual reunification of the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And I think Washington cannot have the cake and eat it. The China-US relations are based on the pillar that there is one China and Taiwan is part of China, and the United States has consistently acknowledged that fact. Even today, it is acknowledging that fact. But so you cannot at the same time try to do certain things to really urge Tsai Ing-wen to move dangerously in the direction of independence of Taiwan, because that will not happen. If she pushes a little bit too far, one step too further away, she will be met with the full total strength of mainland China as a whole in order to achieve reunification. And if US decides to involve in it, and it fails in its attempt, probably that will be the end of the US superpower hegemony in the world. So the stake cannot be higher than this potential conflict between China and the United States, either in Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. Let's move on to the second question. It asks about what are the major implications of US-China decoupling for the healthcare sector. How can multinational companies in the pharmaceutical sector be better prepared for the decoupling in the near future? Focusing on healthcare sector.
I feel I still have one point to say on the last question.
Yes, please.
Both China and the United States, if we want to prevent the potential danger, and should learn John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, we must focus on realistic talk and by both sides. And any, legal position to condemn other side, any self-righteousness seen on a moral vantage point of view is useless, led to nowhere. And Kennedy and Khrushchev to abandon all the fuss, to talk about the issue by the only way to prevent a potential major conflict.
Even though Cuba and Taiwan are different in legal status, I think what the United States is doing recently.
This is a two-sided issue.
Yes, I know. Is similar to what the Soviet Union was doing.
Want to conflict, to prevent the military conflict.
Absolutely.
And I think the massive attack against Taiwan will bring something which China does not desire.
Absolutely. War is always the last choice, the last resort. And I would say, whatever US weapons now being exported to Taiwan eventually is fully achieved. So be careful of what you are doing, because you are talking about a mega trend that from the Chinese national psyche is inevitable, is not stoppable. You are talking about the overall total strength of the 1.4 billion.
Also bring the attention. You look at last month, Chinese side also very careful.
Victor, maybe
Taiwan issue deserves a lot of
attention. Answer the second question, and then
yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, Mary. You have
Okay, I
any?
think the question was about decoupling in the medical supply sector or pharmaceutical sector. Well, first I want to say that there is a great deal right now of cross-pollination between the biotech sector in the US and the biotech sector in China. Not only the training of Chinese in the US, but labs and R&D that's being done in China for multinational corporations. So in this area, there has been a tremendous amount of cooperation. Obviously, particularly the pandemic and the politicization of the pandemic could lead to some bifurcation. But I don't think the pharmaceutical companies are seeking that type of bifurcation between the two. So while they may be making contingency plans, I don't think they're preparing for this type of decoupling. It's also good for all involved to have the competition. This is something that was raised before, that this type of competition is important. Having said that, even in theoretical potential conflict, when we have two sectors of equal size and large scale economies. So if there's only going to be, say, one Google, one winner, that it leads to a lot of conflict. So the good news here is that together the US and China are huge markets, one huge market, and there's room for more than one competitor. The only thing that will stop that, of course, is subsidization and bifurcation by the governments. So it would be useful here to have a more active private sector, to have the businesses speaking more clearly, to let this type of beneficial cooperation go forward. So I think that rather than preparing for decoupling, companies would rather be spending their money on R&D and preparing for competition. I do have one thing to say, though, since we were having this little discussion. I don't have anything to say about Taiwan, thankfully, but I do want to say to Henry, I do understand that right now in the United States, the response has been quite pathetic to the COVID-19. And we are seeing some of the disadvantages of having everybody who feels like they are the king. And that's how Americans feel. But I would urge people to take the view that I take when I'm teaching my students about the Chinese economy, which is that, brilliant economies grow and change and they adapt and they're resilient. And the American economy has shown, and American democracy has shown itself able to change and adapt. And we will see that. There will be changes that go forward after this experience. So it would be unwise to count the American democracy out. We are seeing a conflict, or some, let's just say, the simultaneous presence of two distinctive way of governing. We are in this panel, I think, trying to discuss ways to de-risk that relationship, to bring it closer together. So I would say right now, COVID-19 has the United States in a tough spot, but I think a year from now, you'll see us in a very different position. We'll see. I don't know, like everybody else. Now, I do know that we are a highly innovative company. The innovations that exist today were created in the United States, and I think it's way too early to sign the death warrant here. So, you know, let's just be optimistic. Let's think about ways to de-risk this, rather than thinking about the bad things that will come. We all know we can destroy each other. That's really not what this is about. It's about finding ways, not just to be, I don't think we're near the brink. So I'm not saying pulling back from the brink. What I'm saying is actually to grow the relationship, because we also know that there's a tremendous amount of benefit that can come from cooperation. So I just felt it was important to say that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think, yes, please, Henry.
Yeah, I think, no, thank you, Mary. I think you're right. I mean, Americans are always a great leader and has actually designed this post-Second War global governance system, and everybody benefit from that, and China is no exception. You know, we just want to hope that China and US can work together. I mean, so that we can have a more stabilized world. I think that nobody's counting American out. America is going to continue to be prosperous and also strong in the world for decades to come. And it's just how we want to have a new narrative of how can peacefully coexist. And that's really a hard task for our think tanks to think. So thank you for your comment. Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
We need to maybe conclude now.
Thank you very much, Henry, and thank you, Mary. I think anyone who counts America out is committing suicide in her or himself. And I think objectively speaking, if you look at China and the United States, I would say the United States will always have advantages that China probably will never be able to obtain. There are lots of things that you can talk about. That's actually, ironically, one reason why in China, people like me always keep puzzling why America seems to be losing its own sense of confidence. I think US should have a lot of confidence, unmatched confidence. And if they look at China as a competitor, then beef up your own competitive advantage. You always climb up the ladder. Don't be threatened by developing China as if that's the end of the US superiority in many, many ways, and don't really push yourself, because otherwise it's very, very difficult to recover. We can have another session talking about China versus the United States in terms of advantages and disadvantages. And I would say, having spent lots of years in the United States, very well advantaged versus China in many, many key areas. And there is no reason for anyone to scare themselves out of confidence in the American system, etc. Now, I've also mentioned if China could completely adopt the US system for China's own benefit, why not? But China's circumstances are so different. If you travel the total length and the width of China, you will know this is completely a different country with different challenges, different dire tasks. For example, China may not work that well. That's the only reason why China has to strike out on its own to figure out what's the best way to save itself. And so between these two countries, the only way going forward, I think, benefiting both countries is getting along with each other. And any other point on this US-China relations in the biosector in particular? Henry, you have a several points?
No, I think we have to conclude now. We are already overrun. I mean, the time's up.
Thank you. Let's wrap up. Let's skip the last question for next time, for example. I think it's a very important session that we just now of our discussion or debate or discourse about this very important issue. And I think the presidential election more or less will be known in 5 days. Let's hold our breath. Let's be very, very closely following the situation, and let's re-engage with each other. I think we thank Hinrich Foundation for its contribution, and hopefully CCG and Hinrich Foundation will have other means and ways to cooperate with each other. And I believe the more we talk about it, the more we engage with each other, the better for both China and the United States. So I thank all the panelists for their important contribution, and let's look forward for another round of discussion at least 5 days later than today.
Okay.
Thank you.